You're on.
Hello, welcome to today's presentation. This is part two of my two presentations in the series of DPAD and Sara. So today is going to be about Sara's FMN lab results and the theories behind them. And the goal of the presentation today will be to discuss the theories behind Sara's lab submissions, as well as the predictions, to show plots demonstrating why submissions and predictions were made, and also show plots of Sara's lab submissions and predictions for you to observe. The theories ran through Sara. So there's four main theories. Ideal pairing probability ranges, which is a theory that some stacks have ideal pairing probability ranges. The lab results for this are inconclusive at this point, and they need further analysis. So these ones I need to rerun. They did not look very good, so I didn't include them. I already have so many slides, it would have taken up too much time. But I do discuss this a little bit. They were good and bad, but I'll discuss that more in detail. Ideal partition function ranges, theory that sublab targets have associated ideal partition function ranges. Ideal binding site links, theory that predefined and mandatory binding sites have ideal links. And marker theory, which is a theory that specific stacks in a structure can be considered markers. And this is basically the exact same slide that I showed you in the last presentation at the very end. And so this is really just a picking up where that left off. Going into more detail on the actual theories. So we're going to go into detail first on the ideal binding site links and configurations. This is a theory that, as I just said, that there are ideal links for the predefined mandatory stacks in the MFE secondary structure. So these were described in my most recent paper, Ideal FMN MS2 rival switches, FMN binding site stacks, and minimum pairing probabilities. And that paper you can find on my player page. And the binding site links and configurations, the ideal ones, were determined by manually analyzing dot plots. Well, sorry, not dot plots, but the plots of binding site stacks from the DPAT3 data. So I plotted the DPAT3 data similar to how I showed you in the previous presentation. And the good links have a distribution of plots more among the scores of 60 and higher. And you'll understand that a little bit better when I show you the plots. Bad links have plots that were distributed more among the 30-60 groups, with more weight on the 30s. So this is the 30-60 groups is an artifact of our scoring. And basically, those are designs that just do really horrible, and they just don't do very well. And so they get grouped in these 30 and 60 score kind of groups. The ideal configuration looked at are the long static small loop binding sites, and also separately looked at the static long small loop binding site with an ideal link large loop. And I'm going to go into more detail on that to show you how those configurations work. So I discussed the binding sites, and I'm going to show you what the binding sites are. So in this one, this is the large loop binding site, and it's the stack that forms next to the FMN binding site, and that's what is meant by the large loop binding site. And then here's a small loop binding site, which is at the opposite end of that. So here, this is the small loop right here. And there's there's two configurations, same state. So NG1 and NG3 labs have a closed stack, have a closed binding site with a loop at the end with a hairpin. And the NG2 labs have the end pairs, and so there is no loop there. And that actually has some impact on how they perform, I believe. So from the summary of ideal FMN MS2 rival switches, FMN binding site stacks, and minimum pairing probabilities paper. This was the paper that I mentioned that talks about some of the stuff. So I'm just going to read this little blurb and then talk about it for a second. The best performing binding site stacks had a long static small loop binding site and a 3 or 5 base pair long large loop binding site stack in the bound state, depending on how the small loop closes. If the small loop forms and is an actual loop, it should be about 5 base pairs long. SS safe state NG3 is best at 4 and does terrible at 5. And if the small loop has both ends of the sequence in it, then it needs a length of 3. There should not be any binding site stacks forming in the unbound state for either small loop configuration. And so what this is saying is that based on my analysis, the ideal configurations is a static small loop that is as long as possible and a large loop that is dynamic, but forms the binding site only in the second state and first state. The thing that this is also saying is that actually that goes along with the, I was going to say that this also discusses just the small loop, but that's discussed. I have some plots that demonstrate that later. One thing to note is that the ideal lengths vary by sublab, and as you can see, the same state NG3 does best at 4, does terrible at 5, whereas I said though that the ideal one should be 5, and so really it's between each sublab, but there is some generalization, I think, but it's really not at that point yet. So here's some plots of dynamic small loop versus static small loop binding sites. So this is this is my prediction. This is Sarah's predictions for exclusion NG1. And you can see here that the 1 is predicted bad, 2 is predicted good. And you can see the sample sets on the right here. The bad only had two samples, the good had 92, and the control had 5. So this is what I was able to pick out of designs that were already submitted. So I wasn't actually able to submit any designs for these predictions. So that's why I don't have the greatest sample sets. But you can see the despite the really small sample size, there is a big difference, and the pretty good is actually fairly high, almost to the 90s, which I think looks good. And then here's how I got to that. Here's how I got to those predictions. This is plots of the DPAT data for exclusion NG1, the unbound state for the small loop binding site. And you can see for the short length, so the top is short, bottom left is medium length, and the bottom right is longest length. And you can see how nothing really scores above 80 in the medium, but you have scores in about almost to 100. And so this is saying that the longest loop is the ideal length for this sublab in the unbound state. No, in the unbound state. And then the next slide is for the bound state. And here you can see that there's a little bit like around 90, but nothing really up to 100 in the short. Have everything at 8, and there's not a lot. Longest, you have really a lot of designs up almost to 100. So that's also saying that in the bound state, the longest is the ideal length. So then looking at that, both the unbound and bound state determine that a static long small loop is ideal. And so continuing on, looking at exclusion NG2's predictions for the same thing. 1 is again predicted bad, 2 is predicted good, 3 is control. Sample set's a little bit better. 6 for bad, 39 for good. Controls 37. The separation isn't very good though for the good and bad. They're both in the high scores, but I will, however, point out that the predicted good has designs much higher, close to 100. you know, it's not the greatest, so I wouldn't really be able to make a lot of decisions from this one. But here again, looking at the same thing from the previous slides for examples of those predictions. Short, medium, again, nothing really in the 80s. I mean, everything 80 or less. The long is really long. The long has a lot of really high scores. And you can see the same thing for the bound state. So similar to that first slide, those first two bound and unbound state slides I showed you for the NG1 lab, this is pretty much the same thing going on. And so you got the exclusion NG3 predictions, and you have 10 points of separation almost here. So, you know, in here you actually have a good sample set, bad 14, good 27. And so this is actually showing, I think, a good example of how the dynamic loop is not as good as the static loop. And the static loop really does do better. And so here's the same plots again, the pattern there. And then here we go, state. And again, you can see that the best designs are in the longest stacks for the small loop. And now same state NG1, you can see a much greater difference, in a much greater separation between the good and bad. And this is pretty consistent through the same state labs. So pretty much the exclusion labs are kind of harder to design to than the same state labs. Or actually, what I should say is the same state labs seem to follow rules that DPAC can pick out much easier than the exclusion labs at this point. And so move on to the next slide. And here's how I made those predictions. And this is actually, you can see how this is different than the other slides, in that the same state, NG1, has all the designs around 70 or less. You have this one here, but that's an outlier. I wouldn't really care about that. So I mean, there's that much more variation. So this is much more per analysis. And you have the same thing going on in the bound state as previous, with not very many designs, doing 4 in the long one, and you have everything else 80 or less in the short and medium length. Same state NG2. Once again, decent separation between good and bad. Samples, not the greatest, but it's okay. 9 is, you know, it's decent. I mean, it's not the greatest, but it's good, and it shows a good distribution. Similar thing as what was going on in the previous labs. Really high scores in the same state NG2, and actually I had mentioned this in the previous presentation, but per Eli in the forum, Sara actually scored for same state NG2 the highest fold change, the 100% scores. So, which technically is the absolute highest score, as I understand that. And so the NG2 labs, just wanted to make a note. Gonna have a 1-1 loop at the 3 nuke pair long site. And this can give the appearance of a, actually that should be a 3 nuke pair long small loop being real good, and not in 2 nuke pairs small loop. And so this will give the appearance of a 3 nuke pair being real good when it's really a 3 nuke pair with a 1-1 loop, and then of that is the rest of that binding site is bound. If you remember how I showed you the small loop, how I showed you the examples of what the small loop and the large loop is in the secondary structure pictures. Here, I'll go back real quick. So you have pair in, you would be a 1-1 loop, and then everything else would be bound. And that's basically the same thing as an entirely bound is. And so here you have, so as I was saying, the same state NG2 looks like 3,3 is good for everything, but that's really an illusion. Medium's nothing good. The longest looks really good. And same thing going on, as I said. Okay, so it's the same state NG3 predictions. Sample set for the bad is 5. Sample set for the good is 21. And you can see here again, you have a pretty good separation. The sample set could be better. But I think it's showing a good demonstration of what Sara and Deepak are capable of doing, and how they're demonstrating that the static long small loop is actually really important. So the same state NG3, this is the unbound and bound state again, and as we've seen with all the other ones, you've got the same pattern going on. We have nothing really good above 80 or above 60 for the small, for the short and the medium length, and the long length has designs up to 100. And same thing in the bound state. So now we're going to talk about the ideal loop binding site. I don't have any bad plots for this, just good plots, and this is predictions for. These are predictions for designs that have the long small loop and the ideal dynamic large loop, with the ideal large loop length. And the ideal large loop length for extrusion NG1 is 6 pairs long, and you see how we score almost to an 80. So it's not the greatest, but scores, I mean, it's getting up there. Extrusion NG2 scored in the 100. Extrusion NG3, I have a little bit more detail on this one because I was actually able to put good and bad predictions in here, because the nature of this have facilitated having good and bad predictions more than the other ones. But here you can see the separation, and the real thing to pick out here is that the predicted bad is so far down here. You have a little bit here in the 60s and 70s, a little bit there, but that's still in the bad group. The predicted good is all shifted here, 50 or higher, and it even scores a little bit in the 80s. And that's the important thing, is like the good predictions will have bad designs in them, but the whole point is that it has bad designs, but it has all the good designs too. Because I believe that you can take a good design and make it bad, but you can't really take a bad design and make it good. It's kind of an ongoing theory that I have that I'm working on. And so here's an example of the bad and the good plots, and you can see again, this is similar. It's the same pattern we saw before. The bad stacks didn't have any scores above 80. The good ones did. And this is just, you know, with some lines to show you kind of more of an emphasis of where everything is, because I was able to do a good and bad predictions on here. You can see how you're able to make that decision. For the same state NG1, once again, have really good designs in the 100s. Same state NG2, once again, scores in the 100s. Same state NG3, predicted good, it does really good. Predicted bad, does really bad. There's a huge separation there. And you can see these plots. This is one of the things I was talking about, where you have things kind of weighted. Here you have most of the scores in the bad are weighted towards more the 30 side. And you can see how in this good, you have most of the stuff. There's a lot more stuff here in the good side, weighted more towards the 60s and higher. And this is the lines showing you So now we're going to talk about the ideal pairing probability ranges theory. This is a theory that there are ideal pairing probabilities ranges for stacks in a predicted secondary structure. Also generally applies to predicted base pair pairing probabilities from the partition function or the upper triangle that don't form in these predicted MFE secondary structure. And so what this is saying is that this is a theory that there are ideal pairing probability ranges in required stacks for the secondary structure, but also you have ideal ranges of pairing probability predictions for pairs that don't exist in the secondary structure but are shown in the upper triangle. And I was able to show possible relationships between pairing probabilities and Neutrino score in 2 papers using an earlier graphical analysis method that wasn't as it wasn't calibrated really, and it didn't have the exact data that DPAT's using. And I was able to show minimum pairing probability ranges for high scoring designs in 1 paper using DPAT data, and that was the most recent one. I said that paper name quite a few times. It's really long. And so since this theory, I did a bunch of testing using it, and the results were all over the place, and there was a lot more. It would have been like another 20 slides, and the data didn't look very good, so I decided to leave it out and just tell you guys that it did not look good. So I mean, I'm not making any type of declaration on how good that is working, but I think there is potential in it. When I start working on NewPack binding sites, when I start doing binding sites with NewPack, I'll do some more rigid experimentation. And one thing that I think I may have caused the data to get not so good is I was using bad ranges with a high score, bad ranges with a high pairing probability, because that's what the plots were showing. But I have a theory. I'm thinking that there should just be a threshold. You know, anything above X is bad. I mean, anything above X is good. Anything below X is bad, and not have it be like this range is good, this range is bad, and this other range is good on top of the other range. I think there's issues. So go to the next one, the ideal partition function ranges theory. And this is a theory that some design partition function values have ideal ranges within a sublab. And this is more pronounced in some sublabs than others. The values reported, I discussed this a little bit in the previous presentation, is the MFE energy, the frequency of MFE, ensemble diversity, pairing probability energy, the centroid energy, and the centroid. And here's some examples. Everything on the left is from exclusion NG1. Everything from the right NG2. The top is all the first state MFE free energy plotted for the entire thing. So this is this is 2 rounds, probably 6,000 data points each plot. And the bottom one is the first state ensemble diversity. And so the red box is the zone for designs that do poorly, that score really below 90. And so basically, you can use these ranges if you were to plug it. So for instance, the bottom left, the exclusion NG1 first state ensemble diversity, if I was to plug into Sara that I wanted all the designs with the ensemble diversity between 25 and 40 to be returned, then that would get everything in this box here, and these would all, based on the trends, would all do really poorly. Everything in the 0 to 25 has a potential of doing good. Not that they're going to do good, but has a potential. And there we go. And there's, again, where you'll have some good designs and then a whole bunch of bad ones, because you can't really filter out these extra things. But you can see that there tends to be high scores in the specific ranges that kind of exclude. So you can use that as a way to exclude bad designs, or guaranteed bad, as I like to call them. And so the last thing is marker theory. This is a theory that specific stacks in a secondary structure can be considered markers for specific score ranges based on historical trends. And it was observed that higher scoring designs in the first switch round had a smudge on the upper triangle of the dot plot that did not correspond to a stack in the target secondary structure that was which was given in the lower triangle, if you're familiar with Vienna 2 dot plots. Now, I believe that some of these smudges are actually legs in the MFE that were not fully visible by Vienna. You could see them, because back then we were using Vienna, and then we started using Vienna 2 later on. The main paper discussing this is my FMN switch 2.0 dot plot analysis using ImageJ to observe trends in high-scoring designs. And then the other document is a correlation of intermediate shape and switch lab to dot plot as final stable design, which is also available on my player page. And these legs, the legs that weren't fully visible were called intermediate or transitional states, and given the nickname ghost legs. So if you ever hear anybody call, say, ghost legs, they're the legs that are the intermediate shapes, and I'll show you, and I'll explain that more in these next slides. So marker theory examples and dot plots and differences between Vienna and Vienna 2. So here's some dot plots. This is a good score design from FMN Switch 2.0, which was one of the very first switch labs. And this is scored in 81. And you can see in Vienna is on the left and Vienna 2 is on the right, how you have this faint ghost leg right here. But there's nothing correlating to this in the target structure, but there's a little bit of smudge there. And now if you go to Vienna 2, that smudge has turned into a stack, and that stack is actually in the target structure, and that is a marker. Now the worst design from that sublab, no ghost leg, and there's no smudge, no ghost leg, all there is noise. Now if you go back to the previous one, you can see all this noise everywhere, and so all this stuff here, if you analyze this, that's going to get lost. And that noise, that's going to be found because it's an actual leg. It's a marker. Where here, all you have is noise, and so you're not going to find anything here. And once again, here with Vienna 2, there's nothing. Now the very best score has a faint ghost leg with Vienna 2, which would be probably missed with analysis stuff, because your threshold, unless you set your threshold really low, but then you're going to get a lot of false stuff. But here, Vienna 2, it's much more pronounced. But once again, there's no secondary structure. And so this is where my development of the upper triangle parts of DPAT, looking at the pairing probabilities and doing analysis of the upper triangle, that's something I'm working on. And I want to be able to pick out those structures. And that's what you should be able to do. You should be able to do that with DPAT using the upper triangles. And then running that through the macro analysis function. I just have never been able to run it long enough to where it finished. It takes forever, because basically you're comparing all this noise to all the noise and all the other designs, and it's just massive, time intensive. And so the designs that were submitted by Sara, and these are actually designs that were submitted. The mods were generated by Sara, and Sara predicted that these fit the criteria that I entered in when I ran it. A second. So Sara submitted about 100 designs in one sublab that has never been ran before, and that was inverted same-state NG1. And Sara also submitted a few hundred designs in 3 sublabs that have been ran before. That's same-state NG1 and same-state NG2. So here's the first one. This is one that's never been ran before, and that was filtered for generalized same-state NG2 good probability ranges of predicted ideal binding site lengths in the first and second state. Even though the probabilities is not successful theory yet, it used the ideal binding site lengths. And so it still had the ideal binding site, which I showed you plots of how the ideal binding site will get you some really decent scores. And one of the things that the probabilities does is it's just good or bad in that stack. And so, yeah, I don't want to get into that. The filtered based and also filtered based on generalized first state ideal state good bad partition function ranges. So the typo there. The generalized first state ideal good bad partition function ranges. This is saying that it filtered based on the good or bad partition function ranges. I don't actually have those values to show. I just have what the results are. You can see that it scored almost 90, which is really good for a never before ran lab. And then here's same state NG1, which has predicted bad, predicted good, and filtered for good bad legs from DPAT pick stacks macro analysis, which is marker theory straight up. Filtered for good bad probability ranges for short lists of predicted ideal legs based on DPAT data. And this is again, the probabilities is not the greatest, is not a successful theory yet, but it used the predicted ideal legs. And I mean, we still scored really good designs. So and as I said, I think there is potential in the probabilities. There's just some weirdness I don't fully understand, and the data just didn't look very great, so I didn't present it. I don't think I'm ready to fully present the probability data yet, but it was included in these submissions, so I thought I would include it. And also filtered based on first state ideal good and bad partition function ranges. And you can see the separation and good distributions. And this is about 100 designs per group. So 100 designs for predicted bad, about 100 designs for predicted good. So it's a really good sample set. Same state NG2, I only had the predicted good, filtered for macro, filtered for the good legs from DPAT's macro analysis, from the pick stacks macro analysis, and this is marker theory. Filtered for the good probability ranges out of using a list of predicted ideal legs. And so this is again what I said earlier, the legs, but the probabilities is something that's not fully functional yet. And filtered based on ideal first state good partition function ranges. And we got designs in the hundreds. And any questions?